Ladies and gentlemen, thank you.
Listen to Pavarotti.
Can I be your superhero?
Hello, welcome to The Revealing. I am your host, Pavarotti, and I'm here to discuss the Idaho 4Ks. And is this case getting more and more weird every single day? Let me tell you, I think it is. Okay, so as I'm going through and I'm reading Whitcomb's book, and I'm seeing all of the hoopla out there around Brent Turvey, the defense expert, and Taylor issuing a press release saying, don't even trust Brent Turvey's credibility. He's not supposed to be talking about any of this. He decides he signed a non-disclosure agreement. We get confirmation. The leak investigation is in full force. I think about everything that I've talked about over the time that the Kohberger defense team, which absolutely still consists of Ann Taylor, Bicker Barlow, and Elisa Massoth, still being all part of that defense team, all signing that release of telling Brent Turvey to shut up and don't believe anything he says. He has no credibility. And I think to myself, what's going on here? Who can we trust? I've said this before. And if all this information coming out is hurting a defense plan by Kohberger's defense team to file after the leak was over, then I can understand that. But now we got to add to the mix Cy Ray. Cy Ray has issued a new book coming out in June where he specifically goes into information about the Brian Kohberger case. Now, a lot of people look at that and go, well, Cy Ray thinks Kohberger's guilty. When I read what he's got in that book, I can't for the life of me think that Cy Ray is saying that Kohberger's guilty. What I can say is he says in there many times, I'm not here to determine whether somebody's guilty or innocent. We're going to put the facts, we're learning the facts. What Cy Ray has written is not a novel. Okay, what Christopher Whitcomb has written is a novel. What Cy Ray has written is a training manual to train law enforcement on the techniques of being able to basically compile and investigate properly digital data. But he did include excerpts from the Kohberger case in there, and he did talk about specifics in even the released forward that he's put out. So I've got to stop and think then. Okay, so if the defense team has issued a warning to their expert, Brent Turvey, about disclosing confidential information in the case before it's actually contractually legal for him to do that, and then we've got Cy Ray putting out a training manual here in a couple of months, and he's already put out information in that training manual that talks about confidential information. He was an expert for the defense. He must have signed the same non-disclosure agreement. Are we going to see a press release from Ann Taylor saying Cy Ray can't be trusted either? I don't know, but when I think about all this, it makes me wonder. I guess we'll just have to wait and see, because it seems to me that Cy Ray's putting out information just like Brent Turvey was. So who can we trust in this? I don't know, but all I can do is go through and take the information that I have before me, look at it, internalize it, cross-reference it with the investigation. And one thing it does tell me is how right we were on something that we've been saying forever. But it also shows me the gaps in the investigation by the defense. And these are gaps that I don't believe should have ever happened. And I would think that Cy Ray, doing all of this work that he did, should have been able to recognize it as well. So everybody in this case is starting to get on my nerves just a little bit. Because when I go back to something I've covered over and over and over, which is the defense teams filing for their alibi, and they talk about how the cellular data will show that it can't be Kohberger's car at Floyd's Cannabis Shop. And then I look at the video of Floyd Cannabis Shop and I see the fog lamps. And I go, why would you not include, and by the way, that vehicle has distinguishable features that can't be Brian Kohberger's, which proves what we're saying. And that is totally left out of the argument in the alibi. It's totally left out of the argument in the Franks motion. And it is totally left out of the argument in Cy Ray's new book. And it drives me batty because that was a simple feature that anybody should have been able to figure out. And it would have verified that your findings were correct. So what's going on here? But I'm going to keep it calm and simple. And we're going to go through and we're going to read just a few excerpts from Cy Ray's book where I will show the tightrope that I believe Cy Ray is walking in his training manual. Because I don't believe Cy Ray can come out and say, well, I think this guy's innocent. I think what he has to do because of his long standing in law enforcement is he has to walk a tightrope. He has to point out facts, point out things that aren't right, and not say it outright, let you come to your own decision, but still point out the facts, and it leaves everything open to interpretation. So again, when you read Cy Ray's work, you've got to understand you're reading somebody who is walking a tightrope. Let's jump right into it. Okay, it starts out with obviously Cy Ray giving his career development with his all of the things that he had done over the years that brought him to the point that he's at with creating this. And as we go through, it gets to this point right here. Years later, when the call came about Brian Kohberger, I understood what was at stake. I'd never testified for the defense in my career, not once. I did not seek it out, and I did not want it. I already believed Kohberger was guilty before I reviewed the evidence, and that belief only strengthened as I examined it. See, a lot of people take that and go, "Guys, Cy Ray think Kohberger's guilty." But you got to follow the progression in here. And he's saying that when he first took it, he thought he was guilty. As he examined the evidence, it seemed to be following what the state had, but you're going to see that it changes as he goes through this. And there's something you got to understand about Cy Ray, and I'll tell you here in just a minute. Let's see, I already believed Kohberger was guilty before I reviewed the evidence. That belief only strengthened as I examined it. But guilt and investigative integrity are not opposites. They must coexist. The truth does not belong to one side of the courtroom. When I agreed to assist, I knew I could not be paid. That was not a gesture. It was a boundary. The pressure I felt was not financial. It was ethical. What I was confronting was not a choice between sides, but a realization that inaction was no longer a defensible position. I was defending the investigative process, not Brian Kohberger. I knew exactly what the decision would cost me. And when you really stop and you think about it, though, for a second here, all right? So he's never, ever, ever testified for the defense. And he says that he was not getting paid, but it was his ethical duty to take the case to defend the investigative process, not Brian Kohberger. So basically what he's outlining is he took the case so that he could prove that the digital forensic evidence against somebody was accurate based on everything in the chain or inaccurate based on everything in the chain, because that's the way it should be. And I knew exactly what the decision would cost me. This is the part where you really have to pay close attention to everything he's going to talk about in this book as it relates to the Kohberger case, because of what he does. This is a training manual for other law enforcement officers. Building trust with investigators. I'd spent decades building trust with investigators, prosecutors, analysts, and agencies across the world. I knew some would see my choice as betrayal. Some would turn away. Some would quietly sever ties. And I took the step anyway because the integrity of the discipline mattered more than my standing within it. This was not an act of defiance. It was an absence of alternatives. What followed matters because it is often misunderstood. The criticism came quickly, and it followed the decision before it ever touched the book. Some argued that improving investigative discipline only teaches people how to evade it. The transparency makes better cheaters. That ignorance is safer. So you got to understand, Cy Ray was on a trajectory with law enforcement, building relationships with everybody over his entire career, took this case and jeopardized all those relationships. Now this case is over. Now he's got to bring himself back up here, but he still has to have integrity in doing that. So it's a tightrope that he's walking, basically. That concern is not an objection in this book. It is a judgment about the justice system itself. And then he's going to go through and try to walk that tightrope in these next couple of paragraphs. The problems in the Kohberger case were not the result of missteps or careless errors. The deviation from disciplined process required sustained effort, coordination, and reinforcement over time. It demanded more work than adherence to a transparent ethical framework would have required. Now, you got to really stop and think about what he's saying right there. It starts off with the problems in the Kohberger case were not the result of missteps or careless errors. So you can take missteps and careless errors by the investigators and throw that out. He's saying the deviation from disciplined processes required sustained effort, coordination, and reinforcement over time, which means it wasn't missteps, it wasn't careless errors. It was a deviation from a disciplined process. And that required conscious effort by the investigators, conscious coordination by everybody, and reinforcement over time to those conscious deviations. He's saying this was not malicious, but it was not accidental. So he's saying it's somewhere in between malicious and accidental. It's on purpose is what he's saying, but he's painting a picture and he's walking a tightrope to be able to bring the information. Anybody that says that he thinks he's guilty after reading this, I got a question. The danger was not the case appeared weak. The danger was that it appeared strong while becoming fragile. So he thought he started out with a strong case, and then over time, the holes showed itself. Imagine a man guilty of these heinous crimes walking free, not because the evidence was insufficient, but because the process could not withstand scrutiny. In that scenario, the system fails everyone. Most of all, it fails the surviving victims who are forced to endure doubt, delay, and relitigation that never needed to exist. So what could he mean by this simple statement? Who are for the family, the surviving victims who are forced to endure doubt, delay, and relitigation. What does delay and relitigation mean? Delay means delaying the entire scenario for the families by going through the process of trying to convict the wrong person. Relitigation, is he talking about Kohberger in that sense? Possibly, but I think what he's really talking about is relitigation against the person who actually is guilty of the crime. You could take it both ways. That is what was at stake. Then he goes on to talk about his method of behavioral fusions. Apply this discipline from the beginning, and the issues that surfaced in the Kohberger investigation do not exist. The questions become not whether the investigation can withstand scrutiny, but only how swiftly justice will be carried out. So, again, you could take it to mean two different things. You could take it to mean if they followed everything correctly in the Kohberger investigation and not made up evidence, then the outcome would have been the same and swift. Or you could take it to mean if you followed everything correctly, then the investigation would have never led to Kohberger, and it may have led to the proper people. All right, so as he's talking about what he's calling behavioral fusion, an investigative discipline that reconstructs human behavior over time through corroborated evidence governing and how meaning is formed, constrained, documented, and advanced in modern criminal investigations. And he gives an example of this, and the example is very interesting. What's weird is behavioral fusion. Did he say that because of the Ford fusion? No, I'm just kidding. Okay, so here's why it matters, and pay close attention right here. This is excellent. A violent crime occurs on the south side of an intersection at 9:47 p.m. Investigators obtain video from a nearby business. The footage shows a car matching the suspect's description passing through the frame 2 minutes before the crime. Based on their read of the camera angle, they conclude the car was heading south toward the crime scene. moments before the act. That detail becomes a cornerstone. It supports probable cause. Warrants are issued, homes are searched, devices are seized. The case builds momentum. Months later, a defense expert reviews the footage. The camera was mounted on the southeast corner of the building, not the northwest. The car was heading north, away from the crime, not toward it. One artifact, the camera's orientation, was never independently verified. Everyone assumed the first read was correct. That assumption carried forward into every warrant, every affidavit, every decision that followed. Now the defense moves to suppress. Every search warrant is in question. Every piece of evidence touched by those warrants is at risk. The case does not collapse because of bad intent. It collapses because a single artifact was treated as settled when it had never been confirmed. So I want you to think about what he just described right there. The mounting of a camera that they assumed was facing an orientation where the vehicle was going one way, but instead of verifying it, it turns out they built a case from that and everything that came from that. And then once somebody realized that the camera was facing a different direction, then the case falls apart. Think about that in context with what we've talked about with just the car video in this case. You got cars that have headlights where Kohberger's didn't. Fog lamps where Kohberger's didn't. Then you've got the scenario of the car going past the Sunset Mart. They didn't go through. They went through and verified the timestamp accuracy, but then they didn't add it to the actual timestamp. And if they would have, it would have showed them they had two different cars at that location, almost within 30 seconds of each other. And without that one piece of evidence that they should have verified, they started that. That was their cornerstone. They began building everything off of it. So that is an excellent example of that, I think. And the fact that he didn't put that in the book tells me that he may not even be aware of it in the case. All right, 1.4, the Kohberger investigation. The murders associated with the Kohberger case represent an immense human tragedy. Notice how it's worded here. The murders associated with the Kohberger case, not the murders that Kohberger committed represent an immense human tragedy. Nope, the murders associated with the Kohberger case represent an immense human tragedy. 4 young people were killed. Families were destroyed. A community was fractured in ways that do not repair on a timeline anyone chooses. That weight belongs in the room with everything that follows. This case is not included because it is recognizable, sensational, or widely discussed. It is included because it contains every failure this discipline exists to prevent. Every structural gap, every place where interpretation moved faster than validation, every moment where a timeline carried weight it had not earned. It is not an example, it is the example. So how can people conclude that Cy Ray believes Kohberger is guilty as he's bringing all of this up? Cy Ray's not a dummy, but Cy Ray has to walk a tightrope. What the case reveals is what happens when contradictions are buried under confidence instead of resolved through discipline. Do not mistake this for a failure of character. The people inside the system are not the problem. See, he's got to walk the tightrope. The system is. It was built for a different era, before digital evidence arrived in waves, before behavior was recorded at scale, before technology began outpacing every structure meant to govern it. That transformation has a name, the digital shift. It is already underway. It is already in control. Chapter 2 examines it fully. This case is what the shift looks like when nothing holds it back. And I read all of his information about the digital shift and what's coming and how investigators should tackle it. And really what I think is we need to enact more stringent privacy laws to eliminate investigators from even being able to go in those directions for investigations, because it's exactly what the conspiracy theorists have been suggesting with Palantir and everything else. It is a complete control system, and they should never have access, even in an investigation, to that type of private materials on somebody's life through their digital devices, in my humble opinion. We're just begging for trouble. All right, then we're going to go right here. The Kohberger investigation, the disconnection. The Kohberger investigation had evidence. What it lacked was the structure to govern what that evidence was allowed to mean. And in that absence, narrative arrived before discipline ever could. In that absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. The analysis that follows does not examine whether investigators reached the right conclusion. It examines what happens when no structural mechanism exists to require that the evidence be reconciled before a timeline is permitted to advance. The answer, demonstrated here in granular detail, is that narratives fill the void, not through misconduct, but through momentum. Again, walking the tightrope. He's not going to say they reached the right conclusion or the wrong conclusion. Brian Kohberger can be the person who committed these murders. Can be. He can be. Not he is the person. Inaccuracies, exclusions, or interpretive instability in a probable cause affidavit do not exonerate a suspect, resolve culpability, or substitute for trial. The issue is structural, and it begins with what was available and what was never required to matter. From the onset, the case appeared structurally strong. Digital records arrived early and in volume. Cellular data, vehicle movements, surveillance footage, and location artifacts generated by multiple independent systems. On its face, this was precisely the type of evidentiary environment modern investigators claim to be built for. Dense, multi-source, and rich enough to reconstruct behavior across time with considerable precision. What followed reveals something more fundamental than analytical disagreement. It reveals what happens when evidence enters a system that has no mechanism to force reconciliation before conclusions are permitted to move forward. So, look at that one more time. It reveals what happens when evidence enters a system that has no mechanism to force reconciliation before conclusions are permitted to move forward. So they got the evidence, they came up with the conclusions before actually analyzing the evidence properly to reconcile it. So they got the conclusions before they reconciled the evidence. So evidence, conclusion, reconciliation in that order versus evidence, reconciliation, and conclusion in the proper order, which leads to the wrong determination. And this right here, I've been waiting for years for, and I'll show you why. In the initial probable cause affidavit, investigators asserted that Brian Kohberger's phone stopped reporting to the network at approximately 2:47 a.m., a condition described as consistent with the device being powered off or entering an area without cellular coverage. That characterization quickly became foundational. It was repeated across search warrants, reports, sworn testimony, and investigative summaries over the following months, functioning as a fixed temporal anchor for the asserted sequence of events. No validation structure required that characterization to be tested against the full record before it was permitted to propagate. It entered the timeline once and was never forced to defend itself again. AT&T call detail records available at the time did not support that interpretation. Those records show a connection event at 2:47:29 a.m. with an associated duration of 7 minutes and 16 seconds. There's don't think 7 minutes don't matter. That duration field is not ancillary metadata. It is the mechanism AT&T uses to report how long a device remains actively connected to the network following the initiating event. When the duration field is honored, the session does not terminate at 2:47 a.m. It terminated at 2:54:45 a.m. Those 7 minutes and 45 seconds are documented in AT&T records. When nothing in the process requires the full record to be honored before any part of it is used, Extraction becomes selective without ever feeling selective. Investigators are not choosing to ignore data, they're simply never required to confront it. The artifact is not the consciously weaponized, it is never forced to speak completely. Now, he goes on to really hammer this home, but it gets really critical here in just a second. During that interval, the device generated additional network handoffs, demonstrating it remained actively connected to the AT&T network. The significance of those connections lies not only in their existence, but in their location. The device connected to the same cell site investigators had already characterized elsewhere in the record as consistent with being at or near Kohberger's residence. That interpretive use of the cell site was not new. It had been relied upon earlier in the night to support location-based claims. When the phone again connected to that same site at approximately 2:50 a.m. and remained connected for several minutes, that connection was not incorporated into the investigative analysis. It was omitted entirely. The omission is consequential. Had the connection been acknowledged and evaluated under the same interpretive framework previously applied to that cell site, it would have required reassignment of the timeline rather than reinforcement of it. Had investigators incorporated the 250 connection into their analysis, the assertion repeated throughout every search warrant that Kohberger traveled to Moscow at 2:47 would no longer be supported. And then look here, he has made it where we can't see what comes after that. But he lets the cat out of the bag here in just a second. And it's right here when he's talking about what I talk about all the time, although he never mentions anything about fog lamps. You got 3 tests, 1 answer. Each test stands alone. The first camera does not show a departure. The 9-minute gap to Floyd's is physically impossible from the position the investigation's own data recorded. The surveilled inbound corridor between Floyd's and King Road recorded nothing. Any one of these caught early changes the trajectory of the root narrative, an investigation's root narrative. All 3 together reveal something more fundamental than a wrong turn or a missed camera. They reveal an investigation that never tested its own claims. Not when the cellular data arrived, not when the direction was revised, not when new cameras were discovered months later. At no point did anyone apply the data that they already possessed to the narrative they were building. New information was absorbed into the existing story without ever being checked against the old information. The chain grew longer, the links never got stronger. The new camera that they found months later was Floyd's. And what does he say? The 9-minute gap to Floyd's is physically impossible from the position the investigation's own data recorded. They were working off location information to prove he couldn't be at Floyd's cannabis shop and not the fog lamps. Why did this defense team not recognize that car had fog lamps? And that is the crux of the matter. So in the end, here are my takeaways. When I read everything that I've read in the opening of this book about what Cy Ray believes, I can't come to the conclusion that Cy Ray believes that Kohberger is really guilty, because based on everything that he's put in there up to the point where I would say that he thinks Kohberger is guilty, I would have to say Cy Ray would be an idiot to make a statement that he believes Kohberger is guilty based on everything that he's already said. That's one. Number 2 is, how is Cy Ray able to put this stuff out when he obviously is an expert for the defense, putting out information that is confidential to the defense, and he obviously signed a non-disclosure agreement just like the rest of the experts, yet I haven't seen yet a press release from Ann Taylor and team saying that you can't trust Cy Ray because he's breaking a non-disclosure agreement, yet I have seen one for Brent Turvey saying he has. So who can we trust in this thing? I have no freaking idea at this point, because it's coming at me from every direction. I'm having to duck Turvey, duck Whitcomb, duck Taylor, and now I'm having to duck Cy Ray. So which one is it? I mean, it makes me want to just bap, 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 all 4 of them. But confirmation. That's what I'm looking for, confirmation, because we already know so much about this investigation, apparently more than all these knuckleheads together knew about this investigation. And I now have confirmation from Cy Ray's words that the vehicle could not have been in a position where he could have made it to Floyd Cannabis Shop based on the CSLI data. And I've said that for years. That's just another nail in the coffin, because once you include fog lamps of the vehicle matching up to the location information from the state, verifying their location information, well, my argument now is practically proven until we get his actual digital work where we can go through and pick it out and go, okay, here it is. There's the proof. We just have his words at this point. But I'm going to take his words to mean that, yeah, I'm waiting for that other stuff where I can say, look, we can prove it now. So if you have two competing hypotheses, the state saying, here's a car on video, here's our CSLI location information that matches up with the car. Then you have the defense saying, no, our CSLI location information says you're incorrect. The car's heading this way towards a park. And you have two competing hypotheses. And then you add the element of, well, by the way, the video you're showing us of the car that proves yours isn't his car because it has fog lamps. Well, that only leaves one to be right. And that would be the one that didn't say that it was his car because the car didn't have fog lamps. And that would be Cy Ray. So it puts Koberger going the other way and puts the state over here. And you have to go with the truth versus fiction. So that's what I'm waiting on to verify. But in the meantime, as I'm waiting to verify it, I got to figure out who to trust in this thing and who's going which way where. We'll know if we don't see a non-disclosure statement from Ann Taylor about Cy Ray, which means she's accepting of what Cy Ray is putting out, and she's not accepting of what Turvey's putting out. So in the end, we won't know. But we got about 3 more months before we better know something, because 3 more months is my deadline on this stuff. Please like and subscribe to this channel. Post your comments, thoughts, criticisms. Till next time, Pavarotti's out.